Welcome back to Life in the Stands podcast. We got Jake and Zach on the podcast tonight. We're really excited to jump into all the eras of college football and kind of talk about how it's been broken over the different eras, about how we've determined a national champion. We had newspaper polls, we had the BCS, we've had the 14 playoff, now obviously the 12-team playoff. We're excited to give predictions for that, but we're going to talk about all of the history there and kind of break down why, even though there's a lot of controversy still today, it probably is the best way we've ever decided a college football champions. I want to thank everyone for watching and listening. There is a NFL Finds series going on TikTok right now. It's really interesting, so go ahead and look at that. We'll also be recording a special in-person special episode next week around Christmas. There'll be some more details out around that soon, but we are really excited for that. And with that, Bender, we're going to throw the first graphic up on the screen, talking about the AP poll era a little bit. This was 1936, 1997. Then the BCS era was until 2013, the 14 college football playoff until 2023. And then now, obviously, this is the first 12-team college football playoff. Let's just take a minute to talk about the fact that there was a time where there was no championship game. It was just the coaches had a poll, and then whoever was number
Crazy.
one was the national champion.
Crazy. That's my first thought is it's just crazy. And it's not the same AP poll that you think of today, right? Like that's your top 25 poll plus like the outsiders list. That's what it is now. It's just a list. If you knew how it was back then, it was literally what, picking the national champion before the bowl games.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it just seemed like mad chaos. So if you thought last year was crazy with a 14 playoff and no games, like this is no games played, they just choose a champion. So it kind of blows my mind how they even came to this conclusion to start it. But at least we're here now.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild, and it eventually evolved to a point also where you had a coaches poll and you had the AP poll. So you had split champions because a coaches poll could pick a different number one team than the AP poll. So we're going to throw a different graphic up on screen now to showcase the 1966 season. Alabama won 11-0. They averaged 24 points a game. They only allowed 37 points in 11 games, and they were the SEC champions. But they were number 3 in the AP poll. Notre Dame was crowned the champion. They allowed 38 points in 10 games. They were 9-0-1 though, so they tied against Michigan State. They also didn't play in a bowl game, which is really like common for Notre Dame back then. But Notre Dame was given the national championship before Alabama even defeated, who was it here? They defeated Nebraska in the Sugar Bowl. So before that game was even played, they crowned Notre Dame the national champion in that 1966 season. At that point, Alabama was obviously still undefeated, and Notre Dame had that tie. They also tied Michigan State 10-10, and they chose to run out the clock instead of risking a turnover. So they kind of like ceded to that tie as well. So you can see, like, imagine if that would have happened, and Notre Dame would have been crowned the national champion in like today's age.
I would have a fit as a Michigan fan personally, just because I hate Notre Dame to begin with. But I don't know about you, but it seems to me like that was kind of like a pity championship for them, by the way you described that, and just the way it is, the way it looks to everybody. And it seemed like Bama was the dominant team in that era. For them to be number three is kind of crazy to me. Like number two, I get the arguments. There's always an argument for one, two, but not for them to be number three with a season like that. But you said they let up 37 points in 11 games.
37 points in 11 games is what
What
they
are,
were SEC champions. They were 11-0.
and what are
How are
we
you not?
talking?
Yeah,
What are we talking about? 37 points in basically a whole season. They won their bowl game, and Notre Dame has a tie on their record. Are you
yeah.
serious?
So if you think there's controversy now, just imagine those newspaper headlines. I mean, if I was Alabama at that time, like, yeah, I'd just be pissed, right? That's a little ridiculous. But that being said, obviously, just the AP poll and the coaches poll that didn't stick around for forever because people started to realize, like, hey, like this doesn't really work. This doesn't really crown our best national champion, right? So we've got to transition to some sort of other system. So naturally, in the early 2000s, they turned to computers because that's what everything was in the early 2000s. Just like let's just computerize everything. Let's just like .com era, all those bubbles, right? All that kind of stuff going on. So they kind of they shift to the BCS, and we'll throw another graphic up on screen here to show an example of a BCS season, but this wasn't any better because essentially what they did is they plugged in all the stats to a computer and they asked the computer to give them the two best teams in the country, and then those two teams played in the BCS national championship game. But if you look around like that BCS national championship game, there were five undefeated teams between the years. What was that era? 2014, sorry, 1998 to 2013. So it's like 16 years. You had 5 undefeated teams not be put in the national championship game.
Yeah, I'd like to know what kind of formula they put into that computer to decide that. That's kind of where I'm at with the conversation is who designed the damn computer to be stupid enough to leave an undefeated team out?
Right.
So much for
Right.
computers being smart.
Yeah.
So,
Right. And I mentioned the graphic. I think the best example of the BCS computerized system just being entirely out of whack is the 2004 season. So USC and Oklahoma ended up playing in the national championship game. USC beat Oklahoma 55-19. Oklahoma did have Adrian Peterson. That was his freshman year. So obviously that's a big name. But Auburn was left out of the BCS national championship game. They were 13-0, 12-0 at the time. They beat Tennessee in the SEC championship game. They had a plus 12 turnover margin. Their average point discrepancy was over 20 points. They averaged over 32. They let up under 11 and a half. So again, like what stats are you plugging into that computer system that says Oklahoma deserves to be in this game over Auburn?
so first things first, USC deserved to be there, obviously. But the second part of this is
Reggie Bush, Matt Leinart.
exactly. So that's without question. That makes it seem like Oklahoma was only there because AP was there. So media wise, it kind of seems like it was maybe rigged a little bit. But then something that I want to get to is the fact that that number three team being Auburn, with them going into their bowl game after that, is why those bowl games were so significant. Because there were absolutely just like dominant teams that were playing in bowl games and still playing for something. They weren't sitting because of their draft stock. They weren't sitting because of money, like the transfer portal, whatever you want to call it anymore. So I think there's a whole different dynamic to what's going on nowadays too.
Yeah.
So if you look at it, those dominant teams wanted to prove how dominant they were. Like for last year's example, Florida State got snubbed out of the playoffs to some people, right? They would have went and played their bowl game and beat the shit out of somebody to prove that they should have been there.
Mm-hmm.
It said a whole bunch of guys sat, that kind of thing. So I think
Right.
this was a hard nosed era to be in.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like that significance of the bowl games was really interesting because if you're Auburn in that 2004 season and the two teams get released that are getting a chance to play in the national title game and you're not in it, you're pissed. And like you said, you're not thinking about draft stock. You're not like there's no NIL deals. You're just like, you know what? You better be careful who you match us up with in this bowl game because it's gonna be a slaughter. And it was. And it was. Alabama what? Won or I'm sorry, Auburn won 24-7, 24-6. They beat Tennessee in the SEC championship games. Yeah, I mean, like obviously, BCS was not the way, right? Computerized, just like computerized system, like, hey, like let's pick the best two teams and then just let them play. Was not the best way to pick a national champion. So that leads us to an era that I'm sure our generation knows really well now. I feel like this is almost kind of what we more grew up with was this 4-team college football playoff that started in 2014. And you had a committee now, so it's humans deciding this instead of computers, but it still didn't really fix all the issues. There's still so much controversy. Who's the first team out? You just mentioned Florida State, right? Getting snubbed.
Yeah, not that a whole group of humans makes a situation any better. Yeah, I, I
Leave it
don't
at
know.
that.
Leave it at that. But that committee, I feel like over the years had a hard on for Alabama. But Alabama was the dominant team for probably the last 10 years, or the most dominant team over the last 10 years, if you think about the Saban era. So well deserved. But there was a lot of teams that were left out. And I think that's exactly why we expanded. Right, so we're at a 12-team playoff. There's no excuses anymore. We talked about this before the show even started. Just no excuses. If you win however many games, but you have 3, 4 losses, oh well, you got kicked out of the playoffs. That's not even a choice anymore. Yeah, I don't really know if it was the best though, because it was still SEC Big Ten.
Right.
And it's always been like that. Now you have other conferences kind of showing some flash. And I think today is kind of the way to go, and we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, we'll get there in just a minute. And even you mentioned Big Ten SEC. I think that's I mean, we could do a whole nother episode on what's the evolution from the 12-team playoff now. Because I've even heard conversations around like, do you just take the top 50 teams and abolish conferences and just take the top 50 teams and say these are the teams that are eligible for these games. And then you make the schedule off those top 50 teams, top 60 teams. And then you're not worried about how many SEC teams are making the playoff, how many Big Ten teams are making the playoff, and all that kind of garbage. Because you even look back, another great example of the committee having a hard on for Alabama. Alabama got the 4th seed in 2017 over Ohio State, who was the Big Ten champion. But at the same time, Alabama went into the playoffs that year and they won it all. So you mentioned like, they had Harlan for it, but they also went and won it all. So can you really blame the committee for putting him in that fourth spot? Like, not really.
You can if they lose, right? Like the winning helps, but at the same time, Ohio State being kicked out of the playoffs as a Big Ten champion is the reason why they looked at an expanded playoff for so long and what number that should have been, whether it was 8, 10, 12, whatever it was, because a team like Ohio State could have snuck in there in, let's say, an 18 playoff and won it all. So
Yep.
no matter
Yep.
what you do, even if you did the 50 team thing that you were talking about, you're still going to piss people off, right? Like, 'cause there's smaller schools that are going to be like, well, we can beat Colorado's ass, or we can beat up on Alabama because Saban's not there anymore. They're not as good. Like, you're going to get the smaller schools that are talking about it. So you're going to piss people off no matter what you do.
Yeah. And that's a good segue into the conversation around the 12-team playoff because we thought that it was going to solve some of those issues, right? The first one or two teams left out at 5 or 6 in the 4-team format, it's like super pissed. It's the same problem. Now it's just 13 and 14. It's the exact same thing. But I think NIL money really makes a big difference in this too, though, when you talk about those conferences, because I mean, some of those Big 12 teams, some of those ACC teams, they're going to have the same 20, $21 million bank account, whatever the cap is for whatever they decide. They're all going to be competing at the same level. And some of those Big 12 teams, some of those ACC teams are going to be able to bring talent there. Bill Belichick just went to UNC. I'm excited for that. I am super excited for that.
Yeah, and if you think about it, college football is kind of like NFL free agency. That's how I look at
Yep.
it because
Yep.
you are really pulling guys from school to school. Like Michigan got Underwood for next year.
Mm-hmm.
Look at all the guys that are following with him because they're going to make hella money off of him having NILs. In turn, increases their play because he's a great player. He's a number one quarterback recruit. He's going to improve their play, get them on NIL deals, whether they make pros or not. They're all getting deals. And it's just going to turn in. I wonder if there's going to be a time where there's going to be super teams again with how much NIL money certain teams have.
Right.
Now, I think there's a lot of parity in the league currently, and that's why you're seeing Alabama and all these other teams finally having 2 to 3 losses in the season, right? But I think you're going to see the dynamics start to piss a lot of people off depending on how the money works.
Yeah, for sure. Because, I mean, when you go to a big name school like, Alabama and Tulane can both have a $21 million budget for their NIL deals. But if you're going to Alabama, what other NIL deals other than from the school are you picking up?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're at Alabama and not Tulane, right? So I think that's going to start to definitely play a role. It is bold of you to assume that Bryce Underwood's just going to be the starter at Michigan when Kirk Herbstreit's son is also committed there. It's kind of crazy for you to just assume that. But with that,
Bro.
Bender, let's kind of gear towards wrapping the show up. We got to give predictions for the college football playoff. We got the first round of it coming up on Saturday. Obviously, going to be really exciting. Let's start. Let's start with the Notre Dame Indiana game. I think that's one of the more interesting ones. Notre Dame Indiana. Who do you got? We'll pick first round, and then we'll kind of just pick our champions. And I think we'll do it that way.
Okay. Now, I haven't really thought about it. So a lot of these picks are going to be on the fly. And it's more fun that way, to be honest with you.
100%.
I'm going to choose Indiana just because they've been a dominant team all year. Their defense is what's going to keep them in the game, even with what you can call their backup quarterback. They've been pretty steady as a team. Notre Dame is, again, one of those teams that I don't respect because they don't play nobody all year or they lose a game to a nobody. It's a team that's bound to fall apart, especially in the playoffs. Kind of sounds like my Cowboys. They're going to fall apart. But no, Notre Dame's going to fall apart. Indiana wins.
Yeah, I like Indiana in this one too, actually. I kind of agree with you with Notre Dame. I feel like at some point they're going to have to join a conference. Like you can't. I just feel like you're not going to be able to stay independent for forever with where college football is going. But let's jump to the 8 versus 9 game: Ohio State and Tennessee.
You're going to kill me with this one. I have Ohio State winning. I think Tennessee's overrated, and I think Ohio State is a false 8 seed. I think they're better than an 8 seed. That's where I'm at.
I'm in 100% agreement. Don't I think the Ohio State Michigan game you can just wipe off your records, stats, whatever. Like it's irrelevant because it's like watching Steelers Ravens. Like you can try to make assumptions based off what should happen in games. Like you can't. It's different. It's different. So like Michigan, Ohio State, like that's whatever. They only lost to Oregon. Other than that, like I agree with you. They're a false 8 seed. I think they could go pretty far.
Yeah, don't take that win away from us, please and thank you.
That's the one bright spot in Michigan season. I will let you have that. All right, Texas and Clemson.
I think this is a great game. I think this is actually going to be closer than what people think, but I still think Texas wins. Clemson, I think, probably should be the conference champion, potentially. So, they have a chance. But Texas has been rolling all year. They do have some bad losses. I believe they lost to Georgia twice, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't love Texas. I don't know. I don't know. I don't love Texas, but at the same time, I feel like Clemson is the worst team in the entire playoff.
Hmm. Mm-mm. I think it's SMU.
So
Which
let's jump over
actually,
to the Penn State SMU game.
let's bounce right to it. I freaking hate Penn State, but they're gonna beat us.
I mean, yeah, I think it'll be hard for SMU to come into Happy Valley in a whiteout environment in a playoff game and do that. I think that'll be really difficult for SMU to win that game. So, not even coming from a Penn State fan, it's a really bad draw for SMU. It's a really bad draw for SMU.
A lot of these teams are gonna feel the Big Ten big time. Pause.
Yep, agreed though.
But
With that, Bender, who's your national champion?
national champion. Ooh, let's do damn pop quiz time again.
Yeah, I put you on the spot. I'm making you answer first with all of these.
All right, I'm gonna give you the quick rundown. Penn State beats SMU and Boise. Indiana beats Notre Dame. Georgia wins that, so you're gonna see Georgia versus Penn State. I think you're going to see Georgia beat Penn State and get to the national championship game. So now I think Texas beats Clemson. Texas beats ASU. I think ASU is a false four seed. They don't play a whole lot of good teams. SEC is going to crank them. Ohio State wins Tennessee. I think Ohio State beats Oregon, and I think Georgia beats Ohio State in the national championship game.
So I will agree with most of what you just said. I like the pick of Ohio State or over Oregon because I feel like there's so much pressure on Oregon. If they have to play Ohio State in that game, that mentally is going to be so incredibly difficult for them, and Ohio State is going to come out firing, absolutely firing in that game. So I do agree with all of that. I think the one difference that I'll make there is that I think Ohio State does beat Georgia in the national championship game. They almost beat Georgia a couple years back in the playoffs, and they lost on that last minute field goal that was just shanked. And I think if you looked at the teams back then, that Georgia team was better than this Georgia team. And I think this Ohio State team is better than that Ohio State team was. So I think they're almost going in like opposite directions. So I feel like if that game was like that, I feel like Ohio State might be able to pull it out this year if they ended up with Georgia in the national champion.
And the caveat I want to bring up is that Ryan Day is coaching for his job. If he doesn't make
Yeah.
if he doesn't make that game, it's over.
Yep. Now I will say this: if Penn State does end up beating Georgia, and I do think that'll be a really good game. Penn State and Georgia, like
Say
those
it.
are ground and pound teams.
I'll
I
say
will
it.
say it. I will say it. If it's Penn State and Ohio State in the national championship, I feel like that may be the one that they pull out. That may be the one that they pull out.
They ain't pulling shit out.
Bender is not a Penn State fan, if you can't tell. But this has been another episode of Life in the Sands podcast. Really appreciate everyone watching and listening. A ton of fun to go through those different college football eras. And Bender, I think we can agree this is definitely the best it's ever been in terms of crowning a national champion. It's not perfect. There's always going to be controversy, but it's the best we've ever gotten to.
I agree, and it's the most entertaining for people watching at home.
Definitely, definitely. So, again, thank you for watching and listening. Remember to like and subscribe, comment down below what you'd like to see next, and we'll see you on the next episode.